and I put out a few items that were donated a number of years ago by James Warga, who was a beekeeper. Beekeeping was a large industry here in Cass County, and there's also a copy of a photo there of an apiary south of Plattsmouth in 1885. The original's on the exhibit up front, so. And we're glad to have Joel Cronk here today and his mother Jeanette. He's in the beekeeping business, and he's going to tell you about modern beekeeping, right?
Maybe a little history on them, just some things that, as you see in that picture, really haven't changed much over the years.
Nice and loud, please. Loud.
Okay. So, my name is Joel Cronk, Joel Beef Grandma Raw Honey. Today we're talking about beekeeping that I commonly do. A lot of beekeeping done today. This is one of my yards of bees. Want to hit the next slide? Start out with common tools of beekeeping. So I almost always, I say almost because sometimes I don't, wear personal protective equipment. Basically, typically it's just a bee suit. Goes over my head and over my arms and shoulders, a jacket, and gloves. And bees typically cannot sting through this area. Sometimes they can. And these gloves are also mostly sting proof. But I wear these gloves while going through and inspecting hives. Then I have my smoker. There is a saying that smoke calms the bees. Now, I do use smoke, and I use it sparingly, because smoke doesn't actually calm the bees. It doesn't aggravate them either. It's just like if you smell a faint whiff of smoke in your house, you're going to go figure out what's going on. But typically, it's just a little bit of a distraction as to why there's some beekeeper that's pulling all the frames out of their hive. Got my hive tool. Basically, this is coated in propolis. It's a sticky glue that bees use to glue their entire hive together. They use it on everything. Basically, your hive tool is what you'll use to crack covers off of the lids of hives, remove boxes from the stack, pull frames out of the boxes, all of it, because they get covered in propolis, and they already fit fairly snug, so they don't really want to come out. Then there is queen marking tools, which you can see in this picture in the center, and this one right here. This is a queen marking cage, so it's got a pipe and a little screen on the end, a plunger with a foam pad on the end of it. You put the queen in here, just hold her in just snug enough that she doesn't get hurt, but just enough to where she can't move around. And you have a paint marker, and specific kinds of paint markers are better, but you just put a dot on the thorax, the middle section of the queen, simply for identification purposes. There is also a queen clip, and this is just basically a clamshell. You just reach on the frame, pick up the queen, and then she can't get away. Just lightly, gently picks up the queen without harming her. Wonderful tool to use. I have actually only gotten this one to start using this year, but I will probably be using these throughout the rest of my beekeeping journey. Next slide.
Okay, explain the color, why the color matters.
Paint marker colors? Okay. So, on identification of marking queens, part of why you want to paint the queen just a little bit on the thorax is because if you find a queen that's not marked, either she hasn't been marked yet or you don't know what year she's from. Typically she's a newer queen from a newer year. Whereas this year, 2025, was blue, 2024, last year was green, the year I got into beekeeping was red, 2023. Next year is white, and then the year after that is yellow. So basically every 5 years it cycles through. Then it'll be red, then green, then blue again. So basically, if you find a queen this year that has a red dot on her, you know she's probably 2 years old because she's typically from 2023. This year's 2025, which means blue. If you find a blue dot queen, you'll know when you're going through a hive, that queen is from this year. Or 5 years ago, but that doesn't commonly happen because queens only live about 2 years maximum. Some have lived as long as 5 or even more, but typically they average about 2 years. Yep. So, common hive equipment. I use the Langstroth hive equipment. So there's all sorts of different types of hive, long Langstroths, top bar hives, skeps, all sorts of them. I use Langstroth, which is shown here. It's practically the most common beekeeping equipment used in the industry. Not sure I remember all the history on it. I believe it was done by the AI Root Company back in, I think it was like 1890 or something like that. But basically he went and made all of the equipment, one standard size, one standard shape. You have deeps and mediums, or deeps and then mediums, and there's also shallow boxes. And then there's also 8-frame boxes and 10-frame boxes. So this box here has 8 frames in it. Or no, this one has 10 frames in it, but there's some boxes that have 8 frames in it. This one I use 10 frame equipment because it's kind of more common, a little bit easier to get parts for, and frames typically come in packs of 10 or 20, easily dividable by a 10 frame box. So that is where the box sizes for the Langstroth hives commonly came from. And then I have the queen excluder on here. That keeps the queen from going up from the brood chamber into the honey, so you get just honey in your honey supers. Bottom board, which has a notch right here for the entrance so the bees can go in. This is a reversible bottom board, so you can have taller or a shorter. I believe it's set to the 3/8, which is the shorter size. And then there are 2 common types of covers that I know of, or lids. The one shown here is a telescoping cover, so it has an inner cover and an outer cover. The inner cover has a small hole in the center. This one is called migratory beekeeping cover, commonly used by large commercial operations for trapping bees. I use them because they're cheaper, easier to use, and you can, on this kind, just flip it over and put it on here if you want to mark something inside the hive, just as an easy. You walk up, you see a note on here that the hive lid is upside down. It could mean all sorts of things. It needs feed, is queenless, needs more bees added to it, whatever it might be. But I commonly use migratory covers in my operation. So there's also the medium honey super, which has smaller frames. Honey weighs a ton. I commonly use medium boxes for honey. This box here, when full of honey, capped out, entirely ready to extract and harvest, can weigh about 55 to 65 pounds.
Wow.
Now I use a queen excluder on all of my hives for honey production. That's just to keep the highest quality honey above the excluder. Sometimes the queens won't go up into the honey supers anyway if you don't have a queen excluder, but I always use them because I want to make the best, the highest quality honey you can make. This is a deep box, so it has slightly taller frames. I always use deep boxes in my brood chambers. I have never used medium boxes. I have done like 3 or 4 deep honey supers before. This box here, when full, will weigh about 85 to 100 pounds, capped out, ready to harvest. The difference between a brood chamber and a honey super, because you can have medium boxes as your brood chambers and deeps as your honey supers, or even shallows, or there's another size that's in between shallow and medium, and one that's in between medium and deep. They're not as common. You can use those for brood chambers and honey supers also. What defines a brood chamber or honey super is where the brood is kept or where the honey is kept. So honey super is short for surplus, which is excess honey that the hive doesn't really need. So when they have a surplus of honey, we can take extra off these boxes on top of the queen excluder. This hive is only a single deep with 1 deep box on the brood chamber. I have done double deep hives before, which is actually what most of my hives run as. The picture on the very first of the slide was in the very early spring, which is why the colonies were super short, is because I had just split them off of other hives. Now, you can have as many deep boxes as you want in your brood chamber. Typically 1 or 2 deep boxes is what I like to use. You can use mediums or shallows in your brood chamber also, but I prefer to use deep boxes for the brood chamber and medium supers as the honey supers. Medium boxes, I have stacked them out as tall as 5 and 6 per hive, which total on hive, a double deep hive with 5 or 6 supers, winds up being about this tall, and you put the heaviest honey to the top, which means I have to pick a 60-pound box off of a stack this tall. A little bit chaotic. So the queen and the brood will reside in the bottom, the honey resides in the top. Next slide. Actually, hold on, can you go back one? I just remembered something. So on this slide, this here's a frame of brood. This is a queen. So you see, these are standard worker bees, and this here is a queen. So that right there is where I put the dot. This is an unmarked queen. Good?
So how do you tell the queen from the rest of them?
A lot of beekeepers struggle with that. A lot of them don't. I have actually gotten to where I don't even look for the queens anymore because I accidentally find them. I'll just turn the frames over. I can practically speed through hives, just pick up a frame and find the queen on it almost immediately. The queen is slightly longer. So this is the length of a queen. Right here, move this way. This is the length of a worker bee. So worker bee in comparison is about 2/3 of the length of a queen. Sometimes queens can be a little bit shorter. Sometimes they can be a little bit longer. But there's all sorts of little differential items per queen or worker bee, you'll notice. Such as worker bees have their back legs, they have 6 legs. The far back legs have pollen baskets on them. That's where they'll make a ball of pollen as they go between flower to flower and put that on their legs. Pollen is high in protein, which they'll bring back to the brood chamber because you can't really live on just a sugar diet for the bees. They have to have protein to it also. But the queens do not have pollen baskets. That's one of the easiest ways I've found to observe a massive cluster of bees on a frame. It's just look for which ones don't have pollen baskets, look for which ones do. Whichever one doesn't, that's probably a queen. The other thing is, queens will have their thorax is typically smoother. It doesn't have as much fur on it or hair as it is on bees. These other bees are kind of fluffy on their thorax. That's another way to easily tell between queens and worker bees. Next one. So that brings us to honey production. Honestly, favorite part about all of beekeeping is when you actually get to have something out of it, such as honey. Now, what is honey? I'm pretty sure almost everyone knows what honey is, but there's a little bit that people don't actually know about what honey is, such as honey is not from the pollen of the flowers. Honey is actually from nectar of the flowers with a little bit of pollens mixed in. Bees haul it back to the hive. It's not bee vomit. They actually have what's called a honey stomach, which is basically just a secondary part of the bee, just a cargo container, basically like having a bucket in your mouth. You just fill with nectar, bring it back to the hive. On the way back to the hive, they added some special enzymes to it, which start the breakdown process. So the nectar that comes in is the 12-carbon sugar sucrose, and they break it down to glucose and fructose, and also add in other enzymes which make 54 abnormal sugars. They're only called abnormal because they are found only in honey. Now, that is on the way back to the hive. They have to store it in comb to let it dry. When honey comes into the hive as nectar, it has about 16% sugar content to it. The rest is water. Now, to get super thick honey that is shelf stable for the bees and for us, they have to dry it out all the way till it's below 19.5%, or no, it's 18.5% moisture in the honey. So 18.5% water in the honey. Here's a refractometer that I use. It shows the water on this side. You can see that's 18, that's 19, it's at 18.5 right here. Depending on the yeast content in the honey, because all of them have, depending on the type of honey, has a little bit more yeast than others. Sometimes you can get a batch of honey in that has 20% moisture in it, and it will not ferment. Now, you can get some that are, 17.5, and they will ferment. Fermentation is where, just like making wines or other alcohols, they have too high of a yeast content and too high of a moisture content. Basically, the honey will begin to rot. That's why it is so important to, before you extract your honey, make sure it's at good moisture. Now, to get the supers into the house or into the honey kitchen, I like to use bee escapes. You can just go through and brush them off all by hand. I like to get the bees out of the boxes before I bring them in. I use a triangular bee escape. You can see it's got a double triangle right here on this board and a hole in the middle. That triangle is actually on the bottom of the board, and there's a screen across the triangle. So they go down into the screen. It's basically a one-way trap. They go into the screen, they crawl across the screen, and now they're into the brood chamber or onto a bottom board next to the hive. Then they can go fly off. But when they go back to that escape, they can't manage to get around that corner and get back up into the supers. Basically, just leave it for 2 or 3 days, and you will have honey supers that have almost 0 bees in them. Now, great trick. I love to use it. It saves me a ton of time, also a ton of headache. But that's how I typically get honey from the hives to the house or to the honey kitchen. Now, extracting, I have basically refined what tools I use for extracting a ton. I just use a serrated bread knife with about a 12-inch long blade and just cut across the cappings. They're just like a whole bunch of jars on the sides of a frame, all turned sideways, is the cells of the comb. Then there's a cappings wax on them. So the cells are made of wax, and then there's a special kind of wax called cappings wax that the bees produce. And it's just a lid on every jar. Now, I just use a knife and scrape down along the edges of the frame to uncap them, just by holding the frame on edge. I didn't bring the knife or the scratcher with, but just holding the frame on edge over the uncapping tank, which is this silver tab here on this bar, using that knife and just cutting down along the edge of the frame. Now there are spots where the comb is below the edge of the frame, and I have to use what's called a capping scratcher, basically that red fork right there, which has just got a blade about here on it, a whole bunch of tines, and basically you just go through and scoop the caps off of the frame where they are lower than the frame bars on here, where you can't get to them with a knife. Now, there is a ton of variation in honey. Some honeys will produce, like I said earlier, a higher yeast content. Some of them are more prone to crystallization. This jar right here to this jar right here, this is early spring to late summer. This honey here crystallized first, just because of the kind of honey that it is. So crystallization is basically just where the sugar compound in the honey breaks apart. So if you ever had a bottle of honey crystallized, you'll notice that the bottom typically gets crystallized first, and then the top half gets super runny. That top half is where that compound of the glucose and fructose separates again, and then the glucose will sink to the bottom, the fructose will go to the top. Some of the 54 other sugars will go in between them. But basically, it will make a crystalline structure on the bottom and a runnier section on the top. Some honeys will just crystallize the whole thing in one block, like this jar here. Some honeys take forever to crystallize. Some honeys actually don't hardly crystallize at all. At about 54 degrees Fahrenheit is when honey is in its prime for crystallization. So the warmer it is, the harder time it has for those crystalline structures to form. But once you get below 54, such as freezing the honey, they won't crystallize anymore because they're now already solid. Once you thaw that out again, they're back to liquid honey. Now, a true good honey won't actually freeze. You can't really freeze it into a solid block unless you get like negative 100 degrees. Now, that is really beneficial because you can put honey in the freezer for long-term storage if you know it's going to try to crystallize like this and you want to prevent it from breaking down in any way, shape, or form. Now, you'll also probably notice this honey here, when it was liquid, was actually almost water in coloration. This honey here is slightly darker. This honey here, there's some jars of honey behind these, but this honey here is more of a golden color, and this honey here in a quart jar is more of a red color to it. That's just because of what flowers they were foraging on at what time. A sweet clover, which we have a ton of here, is more common for crystallization, whereas other clovers like white Dutch clover, which you commonly find in lawns, does not crystallize as badly. That's where some jars of honey will crystallize faster than others, not depending on how old they are or what temperature they were kept in, but simply what nectar from what flowers they came off of. Next one. So there is something called swarms. So basically happen almost all year long, typically just in springtime. but there are swarms. I actually got to do my first swarm catching operations this year. A swarm is where half the bees and the queen will naturally leave the hive in search for better grounds when this hive gets too heavy. Too many bees in there, too much to do. So half the bees and the queen will leave and make a swarm somewhere else. They will commonly hang on all sorts of things: tree branches, power meters, gutters, car fenders, everything. So I have actually done some swarm catches. These two are both from swarm catches I did this year. What is a swarm? It's just a cluster of bees, quite literally, and a queen. They're in search of a new place to make a hive. They will go build comb from nectar, basically build wax. Bees will consume nectar, and then they have actual glands on the underside of their abdomen which produce wax. So basically, like tilt-up concrete panels, they just make cut-out panels of wax, which for bees, they're really about that big, almost the tip of a pencil. Now, they will go form those and press them together and just press each one into a hexagonal pattern, which the cells themselves are not actually hexagons, but are actually circles arranged in a hexagonal pattern. So these bees currently were in search of new grounds to build a hive. Instead, I put them in a box with foundation and a very little bit of comb, and they built out and they're doing great. What to do if you find a swarm? If you have studied a little bit first, it is a great opportunity to start into beekeeping. If you don't know much about it, it's a great opportunity to find someone who does and ask for some help learning beekeeping and get into it that way. Or if you don't want the bees in your yard, what you can do is you can always call somebody to go remove them. If any of you finds a swarm, you can always call me at almost any time of day. If I don't get your phone call or your text message on my phone number, which we have business cards, they're there, I'll hand some out for you. If you do find a swarm, you can call me or text me. If I don't get to you right away, I will get back to you as soon as possible, and we can figure out how to get the swarm out of your yard. A lot of times, swarms like these will just keep on flying until they find a better spot, but sometimes they want to make an actual home there, such as inside of a house where you don't have insulation in the walls, or in the interior of an old rotten tree. Now, I have done a cutout out of a chunk of an old rotten tree, and it can be a little chaotic. It takes a little bit more time. Not quite as simple as just shaking the bees off into a box and taking them away, but it's also a lot of fun. I can also do that. If it's inside a house, that may be a little bit more tricky, but again, give me a call. I'll be glad to take a look at it. I got 2 words, Veramites, and actually I have a lot more than 2 words to say about them. So, what are Veramites? Veramites are parasitic, so they will go and latch onto the exterior of bees. They go in the capped brood stage. So, is everyone familiar with the egg then hatches into a caterpillar, which goes around and eats leaves and whatnot, spins its cocoon, and then turns into a butterfly? Mostly familiar with that? Mm-hmm. So bees do the exact same thing, metamorphosis. So they have in their brood chamber cells, the queen will lay eggs, the bees will feed those eggs, the worker bees will. Those eggs will then hatch, and then they feed the larvae. Those larvae then grow up, spin their own cocoon, which is captive brood, which was that picture I showed earlier. It was the one just below the queen. And then they will spend, depending on what kind of bee they are, worker bee, drone bee, or queen bee, about anywhere from, I think it's 8 to 16 days in the cap brood stage. When they hatch, now they're a actual bee, a honeybee, instead of a larva or an egg. Now, the Veramites like to go in just before the cap brood stage, so they have the longest time to feed on the larva before the worker bees can expel them from the hive. A Veramite can raise 1 or 2 young on a standard worker bee, sometimes like 3 or 4 on a drone, which has a longer time in the cap brood stage. Veramites to scale. This is a Veramite in the circle. That is the tip of this pencil. This pencil compared to that Veramite. They are tiny. Hard to see. This is a mite wash container. This is how I check for mites. It unfortunately does kill some bees. but it takes about 300 bees. If you think about it, that's not very much in a hive. There can be up to about 1 million bees in a beehive at one time, in a very large hive. But this is like half of a frame in a double deep hive. It only takes half of a frame to get 1 cup of bees. You put it in here with a little bit of alcohol. Unfortunately, yes, it does kill the bees, but you switch this around for a minute, then it will tell you if you have mites or not. Now, I always do check for the queen, and well, again, I don't really like to do this. I do it about once every month or every 2 months. I do every other hive on a whim, just to make sure they're healthy. It's for the better of the hive. And occasionally I do have to treat. Now, where they problem, they will go bring disease into a hive. If the larva gets its outer membrane on the actual larva itself, they have basically 2 skins on the larva than the worker bee. That first skin, the mites will chew through that, and then basically they just suck the blood out of the bee like a tick or a chigger does. Now, the problem with them is they bring tons of disease into hives. If you get too many mites in a hive, they will actually overwhelm the bees. They make the bees weaker. They will bring in diseases such as deformed wing, which is where the wings on the bees, when they hatch, are actually crippled. So they can no longer fly, which means they're about worthless to the hive. Because if you can't fly, you can't get nectar. In about 35 days, that hive, if everyone has deformed wing, everyone will be dead. Now, other than deformed wing, they can bring in what's called European foul brood, which is basically where the brood gets sick and rots in the cells. Now, it's not very good. It's not fun to deal with. You can deal with it. You can treat for it with probiotics and enzymes and whatnot. There's also chalk brood, another story. There was another one, and then there's also American foul brood. Unfortunately, with American foul brood, there is no saving it. The only way to get rid of American foul brood, which spreads through spores like fungus, it's basically a fungus that attacks the larva and then the worker bees. The only way to get rid of it without spreading it to all the other hives in the surrounding area is to quite literally burn the hive and the bees. You can treat for it, but it's going to be a lifelong treatment to a not very healthy hive. And unfortunately, it's better to just put the hive out of its misery. So, unfortunately, yes, the only way to deal with American foul brood is to burn. Now, what can be done about them? I can use this mite wash here, and it only takes very few bees to prevent a lot of chaos. And then it just gives me an idea throughout the summer. As we go into winter, you want the strongest bees you can get. Bees, there's about 2,000 that hatch and 2,000 that die every day during the summer. So a queen can lay about 2,000 eggs a day, which means about 2,000 bees hatch per day from cat brood cells, which means about 2,000 bees are born every day and 2,000 bees die every day to keep a hive at a steady balance. Now, that's where 300 bees or 1 cup of bees per hive, or even every other hive, once every month or 2, to me isn't that big of a difference to their entire population. And it will quite literally save not just one hive, but if you get American foul brood in, that spreads to your gloves and your bee suit, and then to all of your hives, could literally wreck an operation of even up to 200 hives. I've seen and heard of it happening. Now, I do treat very, very sparingly for varroa mites. I treat with Apogard and oxalic acid, and I have some other treatments that I'm looking into. Again, with treating bees, I always study up on it first. I always do as much research as I can. I will do a mite wash before and after every treatment to make sure it's like, if a hive only has 1 or 0 or 1 mites in it, there's no need to treat it. It's fine. Now, that's per mite wash per 300 bees. But if you hit like a 2 or 3 or even a 4 or 5, you're probably going to want to treat that hive. I had a buddy of mine who I went and helped last year with his hive. Before winter, the hive was not looking good. Now, we mite washed it, and we wound up with over 50 mites in the mite wash, or 300 bees. We treated it with Apogard after making sure that the whole hive was in good shape for it. Used our very specific time window, temperature, and whatnot. Made sure that the Apogard was going in properly to regulation. We finished that treatment after 4 weeks, and we came back 5 weeks later, might wash the hive, got 0 mites. That hive is still alive to this day. I'm gonna bet if we didn't wash it and we didn't treat it, it would probably have died last winter. Now, again, I do feed bees throughout winter and whatnot, another topic. But varroa mites are very much a pain. They're one of the number one things I'm like always against all year long, from January 1st to December 31st every year. I'm always constantly fighting varroa mites. Now, sometimes it might be fighting them just by keeping an eye out for them with these, or sometimes it might be treatments such as oxalic acid, which to humans, oxalic acid isn't all that great. In quantities, it can burn your skin or lungs. But honeybees are actually super cool. They don't actually have a whole ton of problems with oxalic acid and a whole bunch of other treatments. Now, there are some treatments which I do not use that can burn the bees and tin and whatnot, and can cause other problems inside the hives. But I try to pick the ones that have the least problems to go with and the least side effects to the treatments. Basically, what can be done about them in best, I use oxalic acid and Epigard. The oxalic acid, I do it in a vapor, and it basically just do it in colder weather. It does not go through the caproot cells, and basically it just knocks out the mites, leaves the bees in good state of health, in fact in a better state of health, and also will get rid of other problems such as small hive beetles and wax moths, which create chaos. But in total, often it is better to treat done correctly than to not treat. And often it is better to not treat if you are gonna treat and not do it correctly, then it's better to just not treat at all, because then you can be causing other problems in other places. Now, I do not treat with honey supers on, and there's a saying that the best way to make honey is the worst way to control varroa mites. The best way to control varroa mites is the worst way to make honey. Every spring, I make sure my hives are top notch to go into honey production before I even put supers on them. Sometimes you have to remove honey supers mid-season and treat them then, and then put supers back on. But I do not, I try my very best to not have to treat during honey flow. That way, you're getting the highest quality, the best honey you can get.
Talk about why you use that mite wash versus the powdered sugar.
Oh, powdered sugar, that's a whole other 9 yards. So, there is another way to wash bees, which is called the powdered sugar rule. Now, I use isopropyl alcohol in here, which kills the bees. But there's another way that's called the powdered sugar rule, which basically you just roll them around in powdered sugar, and that knocks the mites off. I do not like to use powdered sugar roll because it does actually kill the bees. It's not talked about, but it actually suffocates them to death. A much more painful way to go than in alcohol. So you powder sugar roll bees for about a minute, also like the alcohol, but then you put them back in the hive, and they can also suffocate other bees, and now you have a bunch of dead bees coated in powdered sugar wandering around in the hive, which can cause a lot of problems. So the powdered sugar roll, honestly, if you ask me, is a much more inhumane technique for mites. It still kills them, it's not talked about as much. This, if done correctly, is the better way to go. I've seen and I've talked with other beekeepers who have accidentally put their queen through the mite wash, and now they're out of queen, get a new queen or make a new queen. Again, chaos, problems, fun of beekeeping. But I do not like to use chemicals if I can. If I have to use chemicals or treatments, I always use organic ones, and I always apply them to the minimal, but in barely effective amounts, so that they are at a minimum, but still keeping problems at bay. So, any questions?
So you've got 200 bees, or however many you said, 2,000, a day that are dying. What happens to those? Do they throw them out? Do they?
So, in the life cycle of a bee, in the summertime, the height of summer, bees only live 45 days once they hatch from caproot cells. So they spend about 3 days wandering about the hive. Actually, it's about 2 days wandering about the hive. Then they spend 3 days doing cleanup work in the hive, just kicking old cappings out. And then they will spend time making brood food and nursing the larvae or the or making food for the queen, and then they spend a few days storing honey and capping honey and making wax and drawing comb. And then they spend a few days guarding the hive. Now they only have about 12 days left to live when they're done guarding the hive, because guarding the hive is like the second most dangerous job to the hive. You are defending against predators that come up to the hive during the day. And then there are the foragers. The foragers are the next stage of the life cycle of a bee after it's a guard bee. Now, foragers typically will only live about 12 days long, and they go flying around, get nectar for the hives. Typically only fly about 2 miles, up to 3 for nectar, and up to 5 for water, if you're in an extreme drought in desert country. Now, I always try to keep good feed and good water nearby if we're in a dearth, which is a lack of nectar, or in a drought, lack of water. But again, I do not feed when there's honey supers on. I don't treat when there's honey supers on, get best honey. And foragers in the height of summer, that's 2,000 bees per day. Typically, those 2,000 bees just don't make it back to the hive on their return trip or on their way out, because they're the oldest bees. Typically, they just not quite all the way back. But yes,
If you're finished.
yeah.
You mentioned that you do feed. Are you feeding with sugar water, pollen
Yes.
patties?
I do feed
winter
sugar
patties,
syrup.
Whatever.
Pollen patties, and I also feed fondant. Now, sugar syrup, I mix what's called Hive Alive into it, a Hive Alive liquid feed mix, and that just boosts the sugar syrup. So I just mix like 1 pound of sugar to 1 pound of hot water, and that makes 1-to-1 syrup. Right now I'm currently feeding 2-to-1 syrup, so 2 pounds of sugar to 1 pound of water, slightly thicker syrup, and then I add in a little bit of Hive Alive per gallon of sugar syrup. Now, what that Hive Alive does is it adds, I think it's vitamins B1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 in the liquid additive, and then a whole bunch of other additives to it, such as amino acids, specific stuff that is great for building comb or storing up for healthy bees across the winter. Now, I feed pollen substitute also. I only use it in an emergency. If I get a hive that has tons of frames of pollen in it, to where it's almost going to be pollen bound, which is where there's no more room for the queen to lay in the brood chamber, and it's all full of pollen, I'll pull a few frames of pollen out, put foundation or other comb back in the hive for the queen to lay more brood in. What I'll do is this frames of pollen, so I'll put them in the freezer, and then I can put it back in the hive, so they always have fresh pollen. Now, pollen substitute is not as good as real, true, fresh pollen. Now, if there's a hive that's just not getting going, it needs some pollen in it right now, it's not warm enough to fly, or it's too small to go find pollen, it's competing with other larger hives, just go give it a 1/4 pound of pollen substitute, about the size of a cell phone of pollen substitute in there. In a week they have it all cleaned up, and they'll have brood cranking in there, and then they can get another cycle of brood through. Then you now have bees that are old enough to be foragers that can go out and collect pollen and bring it back to the hive. So, on top of pollen, I also feed fondant in the wintertime only. And fondant is basically a block of sugar with some moisture in it. And again, I get my fondant directly from Hive Alive. I also get my pollen stuff from Hive Alive because they have minerals and vitamins to it. But the fondant, I have never lost a hive over winter. I've done 2 seasons of winter, and I have never lost a hive in a single one. I attribute it mostly to having strong hives, checking for mites and treating for mites before I go into winter, and then in winter constantly giving them as much feed as they can eat throughout the winter of stronger, higher quality feeds. Now, while I said yes, the real natural products are typically better than substitutes, that is true to a point. Now, when it comes to pollens and whatnot, it's better almost always to give them real, true pollen. But if you're only getting one kind of pollen in all year long, like imagine if you're only getting yellow sweet clover pollen. Bees actually need a variety of pollens to get all the acids and proteins they need in their diet to produce wax and feed larvae and feed the queen and make honey. Now, if they're only getting one kind of pollen in, they won't do very well throughout the year, which is where you kind of have to give them some pollen sub. Throughout the year, I do not feed any kind or treat any kind of honey production, which means no pollen sub during honey production. I try to make sure they're good on that before they go into honey production. Now, I have a few hives that are having half pollen sub on them right now, yes, but some hives don't have pollen sub in them because they have 2 or 3 frames of pollen stocked up from this year of running. And the other thing is, we were going over variations of honey earlier. So, has anyone ever seen honey that is almost dark as molasses? That is commonly from stuff like alfalfa or buckwheat. That's a pure crop of alfalfa or buckwheat. If you get a pure crop of buckwheat honey from the buckwheat plant, it will be black. It will literally look like molasses. You can actually substitute it for molasses. Now, up in Canada, where you get colder temperatures, they have a lot of crops like buckwheat and alfalfa up there, which produce really dark honeys. Now, bees don't digest darker honey as well. Here we have a lot of lighter honeys, so I try and get the hive nice and stocked up beforehand, and then I feed ones that need more added to them afterward, going into winter. But the problem with feeding darker honey throughout the winter is they don't digest it as well, so they have to go out on cleansing flights, which is where they basically go out, defecate, and fly back to the hive during the cold. In Canada, when you don't get temperatures where, like especially in North Canada, where they won't be able to fly for a couple of weeks, even a few months, inside that hive, you really want to have them have lighter food rather than that darker honey, because they can digest it easier, they can digest it better, process it more, get more energy from less honey, rather than having to eat a ton of honey for a little bit of energy. Now, there are actual beekeepers that I know of that will go remove all of the frames of honey in the fall from their hives, go remove the honey from them, put the comb back in the hive, and then put syrup feeds that are super light syrups into their hives, and they have almost perfect results over winter, simply because they change out their nectar. They have hives that they don't do that with. Those hives will almost always die if they have a super cold, long winter. So that's where sometimes it's best to remove some of the natural foods and substitute them for better ones, depending on location and temperature.
Do you grow crops that to make nectar available to your hives?
Yes and no. So this is a fun question. I do plant white Dutch clover, which is a small clover. It is commonly found in the lawns. It makes a little white flower that's about yay big in a lot of people's lawns. If you drive by our house in the summertime, usually our yard is white. Sheet of snow because of white Dutch clover across it. Now, white Dutch clover is a great nectar producer, so we do plant that. We also have a garden, and that helps a little bit depending on what plants are in there. But a fun fact, so 1 pound of honey is 16 ounces. 16 ounces, let's cut it down to 1 ounce of honey. 1/16 of a 1 pound bottle of honey, which isn't even quite, it's almost a pint of honey. To make 1 ounce of honey, it takes about 1 million flowers. So to make 1 ounce of honey also requires about 556 worker bees to go collect from those 1 million flowers to make 1 ounce of honey. Times 16 makes a 1 pound bottle of honey. Now, to a point, if you have white Dutch clover, which can almost have 1 million flowers in a 1 acre yard every day, and it reblooms every day throughout the summer, you could be making about 1 ounce of honey per day across, a month or 2 or 3 or 4. Whereas other crops, like unfortunately having like daffodil or something here and there, to make 1 ounce of actual honey, they'll have to go collect from about 1 million of them. Now, there are some plants that produce more nectar than others, but the 1 million flowers is an average number. But stuff like white Dutch clover does produce a ton of nectar, and it blooms a ton, making piles and piles of flowers for the bees to harvest from. Any other questions?
What do you do for condensation in the winter on your hives?
So, with this kind of migratory cover, it has a little lip right here, which is super short. It's 3/8 of an inch. A lot of times in the wintertime, you can just pick this up and tuck it back a little bit, because I have had problems with condensation in hives before. That was back when I did the telescoping covers, the inner and outer. I got a ton of condensation up on top of the inner cover. The best way I found to do it believe it or not, is vent the hive. Now, fun fact, bees can survive almost any temperature in a cluster if they have food. So, the University of Wisconsin, I believe, did this a few years ago. They took boxes and they cut out the panels on the sides. So it was just the frame of the box. Now they put a screen on the side of that box, on the inside and out, where it's an actual screen mesh. Stuff can't get in and out through it, but it's going to be cold in that box. Put a hive like this, transfer the bees over to that hive, overwinter them. Whereas insulating other hives, closing them in real nice, that hive, they did 4 of every kind. The kind that they put in straw, or they put in a barn, or they wrap them with foam, or put some sort of insulation over them. The kind that had screen on them had 2 out of 4 success rate. The other 2, when they went through them, they found 0 feed inside. So they had lost their feed, which is why they didn't overwinter. The other 2 hives still had feed left in them, which is why they survived. Regular hives, regular end straw hives with solid boards on the sides and a vent on the top, had almost perfect success rates overwintering. I believe they had a 4 out of 4 on them because every one of them they went through and found they all had feed. So in the wintertime, a hive this big, in the wintertime temperatures of about -32 outside, can condense into this medium box. Now, if you have enough food in there, that's great. They'll all pack in real tight. They actually have the muscles that go to their wings will dislocate, basically, the joint between the wing and the muscle, which allows bees in the wintertime to shiver. Now, shivering produces heat, a ton of it for bees. You get a large cluster of bees packed in super tight, super small. They'll shiver a ton, which makes a ton of heat. And then what they'll do is they'll cycle the interior bees to the exterior that are super warm, and they'll just cycle a whole mass of bees around. Now, if you have a hive that doesn't have enough food in one spot than the other, that's where they can't get to it. But wintertime temperatures are not as much of a problem, so venting a hive, great thing to do.
The other thing is tilt.
That's another thing. So if you vent your hive, always vent them to the front, but if you get water or ice or something on the bottom, you'll notice this hive is slightly tipped back. So on my hive stands, they're all tipped forward a little bit. So they're about a ½ inch gap on the back, if you were, or on the front if you were holding perfectly level. So they tip down to the front some. This allows water when you get an icy rain or something that lands on here, it'll go out the front. In the wintertime, however, if we do get an icy rain or heavy snow, I go clean out the bottom board, and I have to go take a hive tool there, and I have to go chip up the ice and whatnot, and reach in and clean out underneath here so the bees can still get out and fly and clean stuff out of the hive.
Do you have, do you put, mouse guards on,
No, actually.
you know?
So what I do is I keep a really bee heavy hive, almost always, but this is a reversible bottom board. So the one side is 3/8 of an inch tall, this side. The other side is 3/4 of an inch tall. I almost always run with the 3/8 of an inch tall side up, almost always. Now, typically, a mouse cannot fit through that 3/8 entrance. Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. The other thing is, even if they can fit through it, these frames sit up almost all the way to the bottom on this box, which means there's not much room in here for a mouse. So, I've never had problems with mice inside the hives. I know that they're around the hives, but they don't ever actually seem to get in the hives and cause problems. In the back? Yes.
How did you get interested in beekeeping and how long have you been doing it?
It's a long story, but okay. It's about almost a 5-year long story. So I have wanted to do bees since I was about 9 years old. So I read an article in a grit magazine on catching swarms, like I talked about earlier, by making an actual swarm trap though, and getting the bees to go find the hive that's already in great condition for them. From there I asked my parents if I could get bees, and my mom, who's actually allergic to bees, you know who both of my parents said? Guess which one said yes? Neither one of them. They both said no. Guess who bought me a book on studying for beekeeping? Backyard Beekeeper by Kim Floto. Any guess? My mom. So, My mom's the one who got me the book. She told me, study up, then we'll talk about it. My dad also told me the same thing. Now, went studied up on the book, read it like 2 or 3 times, went told him all the information as I was learning it. Went through, found a mentor in Beatrice, or they were in Adams, Nebraska at the time, down there in Beatrice, Nebraska. Kevin Monfelt with Bee Bum Honey, and he got me into beekeeping. He's helped me go through some of his hives. He had a free class every month that we'd go to. Showed me the art of beekeeping. I actually bought my first 2 nukes from him. Those 2 nukes are still alive and cranking today. But he helped me get into beekeeping. I studied up a ton, and then I got my first 2 nukes back in the spring of 2023. Actually, I still remember the date. It was April 29th of 2023. I will always remember that day for almost all my life. It was about 3 p.m. when I got my first nukes and brought them home. So I've been doing it for 2.5, almost 3 years now.
I have a question about queens. So you talked about swarming and the queen leaves with some of the bees because it gets too crowded. Are there multiple possibilities for queens in a hive? And when they swarm with the queen, is there somebody else to take her place?
Yes. So there are various ways to make queens. The more of the natural ways, without any human intervention at all, are in the brood chamber. They'll take a frame of eggs, and if the hive wants to swarm, they'll go make queen cells, which is basically a slightly longer cell, it's about yay long, on the outside of the frame. So instead of tipping up like this on the frame wall, these cells will actually tip out and then down. So tip down, they're about yay long when capped. It takes about 8 days to cap, 8 to 10 days to cap from a freshly laid egg. Now, that egg will then will hatch, go through larva stage, cap. Basically, as soon as it's capped, that hive's about to swarm, which is why I make it a mandatory note to go through there every 7 days. I'm through each hive. Now, some hives, which are just packed with bees, will swarm before that 7-day window without leaving a queen to cap, which can cause problems. The other thing is, I have found queen cells which will cap within 6 days. Don't know why, don't know how, still learning on that one. But yeah, they will typically leave a queen behind that will hatch in about 6 days and then has the whole hive run through a new cycle. She goes out on mating flights, and about 2 weeks after she hatches, she will be back in the hive laying just like the other queen that she's made of.
Here, Joel, I have some pictures
pulled
for
up
you.
pictures. What are those ones from?
This is your sting to the eyebrow.
Yeah, I've been stung in the eyebrow once, and I've been stung in the lip twice.
This is you bringing home your hives.
But yeah,
The very first time.
that was actually 2 p.m. on April 29th.
And here's you sitting with them the next day.
That was that
He looks
day.
a little different now.
Yeah, grown almost a foot. Anyhow, that was first full frame of honey. I brought it in and I put it in the freezer. When the hive was like full, I brought that frame in, let them dry on a new frame. Then I went and put that frame back in. In the fall, when I had a hive, it was just not taking feed fast enough, so I put those frames back in. So they had real good honey in there, and then they have plenty of honey to overwinter. This is actually in my out yard. Those 2 pictures, this one and this one.
What's this one?
This is trophallaxis. So basically, these are almost like little teeny tiny miniature flying semi trucks, quite literally. So they'll go take, this is a, I would bet this one is the forager bee, and this is a food storage bee. Or this is a food storage bee going to a nurse bee, making more food. This bee here is passing on nectar this way, or honey this way. Now, basically what they do is they'll practically spit out the honey, and the other one will catch it, basically. I know it sounds gross in the human way of thinking, but in the actual beekeeping world, it's a little bit different than what you actually think about the way they, like, it's not the way they eat. It goes from the one bee's honey stomach to the other, like pumping gasoline from a semi-truck into a tank in the ground, or from one semi-truck to another semi-truck.
So you
Again, got stung in the lip.
So you had talked about the moisture, they have to get the moisture to a certain, do they do that with their wings fluttering? I mean, is that part of their job too, or?
Yes, so bees will have to keep the hive well ventilated throughout the summer, which is again, my hives actually stay ventilated almost all year round. So they'll be vented like this in the summertime. I have migratory covers that are slightly taller, and even I have a few telescoping covers, which I use. And I'll just take a little stick that's about 3/8 of an inch tall, break off a section that's 1.5 inches, break off 2 of them, put one in each corner, and I'll prop this up like this. Now, if you have a longer lip right here, that's a lot better, so that you're not tipping a hive up this much. Now, on a telescoping cover, I like to go and put one on each corner, and then I slide it all the way forward so they can still get out the front. But the moisture reduction in the hive, they have to have good ventilation, and a lot of it is just humidity in the air. So there's actually been studies done, I believe it's at 60% humidity over an infinite period of time, mathematically shows that honey will be at 19% moisture. At 50% humidity, it will hang around 18% moisture. I think it's at 35, it will go down to 16% moisture. So if you can have, like in the height of summer, when you have rain that rolls through, you get a lot of nectar going, and then it's dry for about a week and a half. That'll be just enough time for that honey to mostly cure. You get another rain that rolls through, and then it's dry after that. Not ground dry, but air dry. And that will allow the moisture to wick out of the honey, because honey is hygroscopic, which means if it's high humidity in the air, it will wick it in to the honey. Such as if you leave a pack of graham crackers, or any other crackers for that matter, out on the counter on a really humid day, they'll typically not be as crunchy by the end of the day. They'll typically be a little bit soggy. But that's how honey, for the most part, dries.
Too many bee stings damage your health?
They can, and sometimes they don't. So there are people who are mildly allergic to bees, and once they get enough bee stings in them, they're no longer allergic. They don't even swell up anymore. They don't even get anything to them. You just scrape the stinger off and you're done. There are some people that once they get too many bee stings in their system, they will actually become very allergic to bees and their stings. Now, the most stings I've ever had in one time is about half a dozen to a dozen. Working bees at night with them in my suit, not fun, would never recommend it, because that's when all the foragers are home. All the foragers are the more aggressive, older bees in the beekeeping world. They are, you never want to work bees at night for that reason. Now, with bees, the problem where that comes in is they will sting, because they have nothing to lose at that point. So they'll go protect their hive, whereas the other bees kind of try to avoid stinging you. Now, if you do get too many stings, yes, it can turn you very allergic. And if you get stung, such as I got stung, where's that the picture of my eye? So that's the one on my lip. Go up 2 more. One more. There. So this picture was the evening after I got stung in the eyebrow. I actually got stung right just below the eyebrow. Now, if you get stung on your eyelid or on your actual eye itself, it can blind you in that eye, depending on how much venom gets in, where you got stung, how you got stung. If you're someone who's mildly allergic to bee stings and you get completely overwhelmed with them, you go through a hive, it's just stinging you like crazy. If you don't have a full suit on or other protective gear, crawl pant legs, anything, you get too many bee stings at once, there are some people that it can kill them. Now, I know my mom, who's highly allergic to bee stings, simply one sting will close up her throat to where she can't breathe. Best way to solve that is get the stinger out as fast as possible so that it can't get venom into you, and then get her some chewable Benadryl, which is what works fastest. Chewable Benadryl, you chew it up, put it on your tongue, then it will soak in to your saliva and go through your tongue into your bloodstream almost instantly. Whereas liquid Benadryl has to go down through your stomach and whatnot and then get processed and then go to your bloodstream. So I try to almost always have chewable Benadryl within easy reach because if anything ever happens, I want to have a way to stop it quick. But I don't always struggle with bee stings. There's sometimes where I get stung. Like lately, I can get a bee sting depending on if it's on a vein or if it's directly on a vein or if it's just on a tendon or something or just in the skin. Then, depending on where it is, it might sting. It might swell. It might not. If you get stung in a vein, it's almost guaranteed to swell. Almost always. Now, I got stung 2 weeks ago on my ankle, on the tendon, on the very back of my foot, and that one didn't swell on the exterior, it swelled in front of the tendon inside my foot, making it a little bit hard to move. But still, I was pretty fine. Swelling went down after about a day and a half. Done. So, depending on the person, too many stings can be very dangerous, and depending on the person, like, who is it? Dirt Rooster. What's his name?
Randy McCaffrey.
Randy McCaffrey. He goes through and he cuts out swarms from inside people's houses. He does all sorts of beekeeping. He doesn't wear any gloves, any suit, anything. He can go on and just one day, he will, like, he could bathe in bee stingers and not notice a single thing. Like, you could sting every square inch of his body and he wouldn't notice that he even got stung. Yeah, he's crazy, if you ask me. But again, it varies from person to person.
I will say though, about late January, February, Joel started jonesing for a bee sting, so I'm a little concerned about that.
It's addictive. Sorry, but it is. It's like, I get a bee sting, I get a bee sting. And I get a bee sting, and it's always in the worst spot, like eyebrow of the lip or something. Like, oh, come on. Oh, great fun. Any other questions? We also have a bottle of honey here, if anyone would like to sample some honey. And we also do have some honey here for sale. Anyone want to sample?
And he brought some business cards.
Yes, I was for business cards.
So where do you